Good morning, good afternoon. Can you hear me? Just type yes or in the chat box. I think it's easier, but I assume you can, as I see that Monique has started the recording. So let's kick off. Thank you for joining this webinar on user experience management by NOAA. My name is David Dekker. I lead the education line of business for SAP in Australia and New Zealand, and I'm very pleased to have you here in the call. It concludes a series that we've done for the past 2 weeks, where we've toured throughout Australia and New Zealand with the guests that we have over from the United States, Eric Figueredo, the managing director for NOAA Software. I'll do a brief kickoff, which also gives people time to dial in before we jump into the solution. So quickly setting the scene on where it fits in. As I mentioned, I'm from SAP Education, and we focus on enablement of the SAP users. Basically, we apply focus to 3 areas. So one, and you're all familiar with that, is on the project team training, where we've got solutions available like Learning Hub or classroom training. All of you are either on a project or about to start on a project, and you can appreciate that all these and the people involved in that need to be aware of the system and its capabilities, and as such need to be trained properly. The other aspect that we cover is focused on end user training, and where we have one of our key solutions called SAP Enable Now, that has a massive focus on in-application support, and maybe we can touch on that as well in the presentation to see how that actually works hand in glove with user experience management by NOAA, which you see on the top left, on the bottom left corner of the triangle. That's all about data-driven decision making by monitoring the user experience. Those 3 things together are the core of our portfolio, again aimed at increasing adoption, which means that the return on investment for your SAP software goes up, and the total cost of ownership goes down actually. So that's the reason, I'd say, for our existence. We can talk about project team training and user training as well, but today is all about UX monitoring, and with that, I'd like to hand over to Eric Figueredo. If you have any questions during his presentation, please type it in the chat box. I'm in the room with Eric, and I can interrupt if appropriate to ask the question, and otherwise we will collect the questions and address them at the end of the presentation.
Exactly. Thank you very much, David. So, as he mentioned, I'm Eric Figueredo, Managing Director for Global Sales Operation for NOAA Software, and it's a pleasure to be with you here today. The SAP User Experience Management, or SAP UEM solution by NOAA, sits in a very interesting place in the application infrastructure. So we're going to start out by assuming that this is the first time that you all see and hear about this product. So we're going to do a level set of product introduction, talk a bit about the technology, the business benefits, and then conclude with product demonstration. And like David said, all the while, if you have any questions, feel free to type them into the chat box. If it's something we can answer in real time, we'll go ahead and do so. And if not, we'll try to leave some time for questions at the very end. So with that, we'll get started. A little bit about the product. So there's a lot of software products that exist today that, the reason for existing is to monitor the application performance. So we have 2 specific tiers that generally they are focused on. And the first tier is the infrastructure tier, right? And at the infrastructure tier, we have the big players. We have the IBMs, HP, right? And that's more for management of your storage components, networking components, databases, and things like that. Then you have the application layer, right? And at the application layer, you have SAP Solution Manager, solutions for governance, risk, and compliance, GRC solutions, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with those. Finally, you have a third tier, which we like to call from the keyboard up or above the keyboard. And that's where your end users are, right? So everything between your end user and the screen itself. And at this tier, this is where really everything happens, right? So your productivity levels, efficiencies, whether or not your users are adopting the best practices, your calls to your help desk. So everything occurs here, but ironically, it's usually the place with the largest knowledge gap or visibility gap in terms of objectively knowing what's going on, right? There's a lot of perceptions of possible issues in the system, but at the end of the day, it's just a perception. So what we try to do with this tool is give you the objective data of the user experience to then in turn grant you this data-driven insight so that you can focus your resources to either tackle or troubleshoot a support issue, focus your training on your users, etc. So let's talk about what kind of metrics we can see at this level. Okay, so what are the NOAA metrics specifically? So first I'd like to talk about errors. With errors, we have two categories of errors that we offer with NOAA. The first one is user errors. User errors are errors that you can train your users to lessen the frequency of these errors. For instance, the data entered was in the past or authorization issues. Okay. Then you have system errors. And system errors are errors such as ABAP dumps or abnormal termination of the program, for example, corrupt file system. Those kinds of things are examples of system errors. And finally, you have informational messages, status messages, such as purchase order 123 has been saved, material number 345 has been modified. So we capture all these messages or feedback to the end user and categorize them in one of these three categories, right? User errors, system errors, or simply informational messages. With that, the use cases are very interesting. I'll tell you about training. So if you wanted to focus your training, if you can imagine, these are not tickets to the help desk that we're tracking. We're tracking the actual user experience and what the user has seen. So by the time that the user sees the error 10, 20, 30 times, that's when the user by then is frustrated likely and is finally going to go ahead and open a ticket to the help desk. Now, with NOAA, we can see who is it you need to train. That's probably the most important thing. Well, who are the individuals? And then what is it that you need to train them on? What functionality, which transactions, which modules, what are the error types that they're seeing most frequently? Okay, so those are errors. Then we have response time. And response time is an interesting metric because this is from the end user perspective. So it's end to end. From the time the user clicks the mouse or device to start an operation, so the time that operation returns and does a rendering on the screen, on the interface of the end user, that's the end of the operation in accordance to NOAA and also in accordance with the end user experience itself. Okay, so with this, there's that famous phrase that we hear from time to time. Oh, SAP is slow, or the system is slow. Okay, but it's not going to be that the entire system is slow. The whole architecture, the whole ecosystem. It's going to be a specific operation, a specific module, and a specific screen that's causing this perception of system slowness. So with NOAA, a lot of times when we go to the server logs or we'll go to the database or the network, everything seems fine. But still there's this noise, right? There's this yelling and screaming about the system not performing. So with NOAA, we can go in and see, first of all, is there a problem from the end user perspective and the level of impact that this problem is having? How many users have been affected by this? Is it regional? Is it global? We can answer those questions readily and pretty easily with this tool. The third metric is utilization. And with utilization, it's not just about the time that the user is logged in to the system. It's also the time that the user is actively interacting with the system, being productive. So if the user, is logged in but went to get a cup of coffee, or for example, is maybe writing an email or something, or using Excel even, we're not going to log that. We're not going to track that as active time. That we track as idle time. So we give you both of these metrics, the active utilization and also the idle utilization. And with that, it's pretty easy to determine patterns of inefficiencies in the ways that your users are adopting the system, right? So if your user is logged in for 8 hours out of the day, but only 20 minutes actively, then, what's going on? Is it because, they need some training, they're not 100% sure, how to follow or how to use the functionality, or maybe they don't have access to the correct functionality to do their work, right? Another use case here that's very popular with utilization is if you have customizations in your environment. So, for example, Z transactions. We monitor these customizations out of the box with no special configuration to NOAA and let you know whether or not these customizations are being used. And the ones that are being underutilized, then you can go ahead and start sunsetting them and eliminating them and start reducing the maintenance cost of these customizations, which, as most of you may know, can be significant for an organization. And finally, we also give you what we call a dynamic user workflow. Okay, so what this is, it's as the title states, it's dynamic. In other words, you don't have to prescript what the user is going to do or should be doing in order for this tool to monitor the activity. So if the user is following the best practice or even going off the beaten path there, we're still going to go ahead and monitor the activity 100%. And if you pull up a user's workflow, what that gives you is chronologically all of the activities and interactions that the user had with each screen, in each module, in each application, okay, before, during, and after an event occurred. So you can imagine the value of something like this kind of data, if you were, say, in level 1 support. So a user calls in, and generally, the conversation goes a little bit like, well, what was it that you were doing before the error occurred, right? And the user sometimes remembers, sometimes doesn't remember all the details. With NOAA, that interaction changes 180 degrees. The user simply has to give the help desk their ID and the day in which the error occurred or the issue occurred, and with that, help desk personnel can go to NOAA, pull up the workflow, and see step-by-step everything the user did, and use that to help reconstruct the error. So those are the NOAA metrics, and I'll talk a little bit about the technology. So it's pretty simple. You have a 3-tiered architecture. It starts out with the client side. We have an agent. We call it a monitoring agent on the end user desktop or mobile device. And that is essentially tracking all of the interactions between the user and the application interface. Those interactions are sent to your customer IT center. So, and that could be on-premise, so in-house, or it can be in the cloud somewhere. So we offer both versions of the product. The functionality is exactly the same. And the server receives the data from these monitoring agents and stores it in a database. And the database, if you choose on-premise, could be SQL Server, could be Oracle, or it could also be SAP HANA database. And then finally, we have the front end to the product, to the solution, which is it's essentially the reporting console. And it's based in business objects. If you currently have business objects, all you have to do is import the business objects NOAA universe into your platform and then just connect it to the NOAA database. One point that's important with the architecture here is that the only point of integration that NOAA has with your SAP infrastructure is at the desktop. So it's just where the user is using the application, so the monitoring agent. There are no other points of integration with the servers or the databases or the network components. So that's very important because you'll see in a moment in the demonstration the level of detail that we can capture, but yet we have no effect on the performance of the system itself. You can imagine if you turn on all the logs in your SAP system as it is today, those are all measuring from the server, right? So the act of measuring is actually going to affect the system performance, and I'm sure many of you have had that experience at one point or the other. With NOAA, we are unique in that respect that, we don't actually affect the system performance, and we're viewing everything end to end, right, from the end user perspective. And the other point I'll make here is, if you notice here on the second bullet, we're not just monitoring the production environment. So we're monitoring all the users, all the transactions, the entire application, all of the time, kind of like the black box of an airplane. And the interesting thing about that is, because we're not just limited to your production environment, we can answer questions like, this error that existed or that exists today in production, did we see this error before in QA? Did it exist in my development environments? Okay. So again, we can go back and see when this error appeared, if we did something to try to mitigate the error, why did it not resolve it, and those kinds of things. So those are more of the kind of uniqueness of this solution. And I'll state one other thing, that everything that I've talked about so far, in fact, out of the box, this is actually the only solution that can provide these kinds of metrics, right, from the end user perspective. So that also makes us unique in the market. A little bit about the benefits. So, we have, these are the 6 categories of what we like to call the low-hanging fruit, right, the quickest path to ROI. And most of our customers are using NOAA for one of these 6 categories, either to improve adoption or to improve the efficiency and the effectiveness of their help desk, for targeting their training. And the very next slide actually describes our customers' actual results, okay, for these 6 categories. So if you notice here, for the help desk, for instance, our customers, and this is, cross-industry, global, is not anything specific, but they are using NOAA specifically for this purpose, okay? So I'll just highlight a few of them here. So for the help desk, we see 25 to 35% improvement in mean time to resolution. So what does that mean? That means that, reactively, once the user has logged the ticket, if NOAA is in the mix here, in part of your standard operating procedure for support, then, you can go to NOAA, pull up the workflow, see what the user experience is like, see whether or not it's affecting other users, those kinds of things, and be able to streamline and focus exactly where it is that you should troubleshoot, right, these issues. So it removes that perception, and removes that necessity to rely on the user's recollection of the actual activity. And what our customers have seen are exactly this, 25 to 35% improvement in getting to the results or getting to the resolution of the issue much quicker. The other thing that's interesting about the help desk is that first bullet, which says that our customers have seen 20 to 30% reduction in the actual costs to support their end user community. So the reason is because you can actually use NOAA not just in a reactive way, but in a proactive way. So you can set up alerts, for instance, for a critical business process or a critical type of error, and set certain thresholds and have the system alert you from the end user perspective once these things begin to occur. And more often than not, it will even be before these tickets are actually make it to the help desk. As I mentioned earlier, a lot of times the user sees these errors and these issues multiple times before actually logging the ticket to the help desk. Okay. One other thing here with training, this is very interesting. So our customers have seen 25 to 50% improvement in the effectiveness of the training. And like I alluded to earlier, you not only can identify who you need to train and what is it you need to train them on, but also whether or not that training was effective. So the users come back from training and say, yes, the instructor was very funny, the coffee was great, but did I actually get a result, right, from this initiative, from this event? And so what NOAA can do, it'll compare the before and after, before and after something like training your users, and you can see if the error rate, the user error rate, went up or down for a specific amount of activity. So that in and of itself is very, very valuable in terms of objectively seeing whether or not the training is effective in determining that. Now, because we don't just monitor the production environment, you'll see on the next bullet for IT transformation projects, which is a popular topic these days, our customers have seen 20 to 30% reduction in UAT and also hypercare because of this increased visibility, right? So let me talk a little bit about that in the next slide. So I don't know how many of you are in your roadmap are looking to migrate to something like S/4HANA, okay, in the near term. With NOAA, it significantly reduces the risk of taking on one of these projects. And the value that we provide is at all stages, before the project, during the project, and also after the project. So I'll speak a little bit about these. Before the project, it's very interesting. If you recall, I mentioned that we can give you the utilization, the levels of adoption of your current system. But with that, you can get some very, very interesting insight from the end user perspective. And again, this is objective insight that you wouldn't have without a tool like this. One of the examples that always comes to mind is, you're setting up and blueprinting and planning to do an S/4HANA migration, okay? What do you migrate? How do you prioritize what you're going to migrate over? What are your most complex, UX experiences today? And, the ones that you want to target for simplification. So these kinds of questions, we provide the data to help you answer these questions in a very objective way, and thereby, focusing the scope of the project to something that's significantly reduced, right, and significantly focused and targeted. And that's the value that we can provide, or an example of the value that we can provide in the before phase, okay? During, can you imagine the value of knowing whether your testers in UAT or the system integration testing phase of your project are actually testing? What level of testing are they doing? Are they following the test scripts that you have laid out for them? What kinds of errors are they running into? Once you've taken steps to remove these errors or mitigate these errors, is that actually being effective or not, right? So that's during the project, and again, it's every phase of the project. And then after, when you do and take on an initiative like a migration to S/4HANA, there's an expectation, either 20% improvement in performance, 30% improvement in your efficiency, whatever it may be. They're generally these soft targets, right, that are difficult to measure. So with NOAA, we give you not only the answer, whether or not you're attaining your set ROIs, your goals, your SLAs, you're complying with everything, but if you're not reaching them, okay, these KPIs, then why not? Is it because your users are still using the legacy system? Is it because they require certain access that they still don't have, and it's not allowing them to adopt the system in an efficient way? So again, all these metrics and all this unique visibility and insight all lead to a significant reduction in the risk of taking on one of these projects. Okay, so in that way, NOAA can actually be seen as kind of an insurance policy, right, to something like an S/4HANA migration project. So with that, we'll go ahead and go to the demo of the system. I always like to show the demo in a live format whenever possible, because that gives you a concrete idea of what you're going to get with the solution. So without further ado, let's start out with the training use case, okay, as a first example. So here, what we're looking at on the screen is, all of the modules or transactions in SAP within a 2-week period that have the greatest number of user errors, okay? See here, we're focused on user errors at this time and looking at a heat map of all the modules. So the size of these modules, have to do with the number of instances of user error for all the modules. So automatically, if I just focus on the left half of this screen, that's going to get rid or target 50% of all of my user errors in all of SAP. So that in and of itself is incredibly powerful, right? And I've answered that first question, which is, where is it that I should focus? In what content should I start targeting to train my users? What's the functionality where they are struggling the most? So that's answered my first question. and all I did was pull up this dashboard here. So the second question is, let's go ahead and drill down a bit. Let's pick one of these. Let's pick MM42 as an example. I see that there's 2,802 user errors that my users experienced, and I see 72 users had this issue, right? So what I'd like to do now is I want to filter this specifically by this module of MM42, okay? So I'll just type in here MM42. I'll rerun this report. And now I want to understand, okay, how are these errors distributed, right? So I'm looking at this pie chart, and it shows me that about 80% of all of my errors that had to do with this transaction, with MM42, came from these two cities, the green and the blue cities here, right? So if I just focus on those, now I'm targeting 80% of all my user errors in MM42 across my entire SAP population. If I look on the right, I see the users themselves, right? The individuals that have had the highest frequency of user errors for this function MM42. Now what I'd like to do is I want to drill down a bit further. I want to choose the region that has the highest number of errors for this transaction. So I'll go ahead and click on that. You notice the right side of the screen here changed. And now I'm seeing the users themselves, specifically for this city, for this region, that have experienced the highest number of errors for MM42. The interesting thing is, are 40 errors in a 2-week period, is that bad or is that good? Is that acceptable or not, right? So what we try to do, because these metrics are unique, we try to benchmark them for you. I'll draw your attention to the upper right-hand side here where you see average messages per user, errors per user is 39, right? So basically, if we take, the number 39, use that as our benchmark, any user that has over 39 errors, maybe that's who we're going to target, right? And with that, we might even get rid of 90% of all my user errors for this city. Okay? So now that I understand who I need to train, what I need to train them on, and which regions I should focus, now I want to know, okay, what were the errors? So this user here had 173 errors. And what I'd like to do is I want to go ahead and drill down. So I've clicked on this drill down button here. And that's going to take me to what we call a summary level report that's going to tell me not only what these error types were, but which ones occurred more frequently. So let's go to that report, and we see here, now we're getting an idea, a concrete idea, of what specific errors this user has had, right? So here, validity data in the past is the error that's occurred the most. It occurred 31 times within this time period that we're analyzing. And again, all these errors are all user errors, and it's something that we can train the user to change the behavior and lessen the frequency of these errors, and thereby increasing the efficiency, correct? So now what I'd like to do is I want to drill down a bit deeper. I understand now where the user, what kinds of errors the user is having. Now I want to understand where these errors are occurring, right? So if I pick one of these errors here at random, so let's pick this tax category CTX1 is not defined for the country. I see it occurred 5 times. So I'm going to click on the number 5, and it's going to take us a level deeper. And now we're going to the detailed data, where you see this hierarchy, right? You see application, you see the module, and you see the screen. So with application, we notice it's a production 2 retail application. The module is going to be MM42, as we know. With the screen, now we're understanding that the user was trying to change an article. And we actually even have the article ID as part of the screen name. And you see that in that column here, right? We have the user, obviously identified there, the PC, and the error message itself. So let's make a bit of a switch now, and let's say we're part of the support team, and this user has called in. They're experiencing a lot of issues on, in this case, the 29th of April, right? And so they've given us their ID, they've given us their the date where this error occurred, and what we'd like to do now is get the context of the activity of this user, right? So if we click on this arrow, that's going to take us to what we call a user workflow report. And if you recall, this is a report that chronologically tells you the user's journey, right, step by step within a particular day. The way that we got to this, it's basically going to give us an hour of workflow before and after that event occurred, in this case, the error that we were seeing, or that the user was seeing, right? In this case, we're starting with a session. You can have multiple sessions in SAP open in parallel, and with this solution, that's not an issue, so we're going ahead and assigning an ID to each of the sessions. You have the application, the module within the application, the screen within the module, and the activities, the user activities within each of the screens, with a description column describing the activity. If you recall, I mentioned that we're not only capturing errors, we're also capturing status messages, informational messages, right? So if you see here, this is an example of one. So you see article 206.11.373 has been changed. So that's not an error. You see it's a message, but it's part of the user experience. So obviously we're capturing that. And with that, you can actually get very interesting data from Noah. Say, you know what, I want to understand how many times was this article changed in the last 2 weeks? And who changed it, right? So you can answer those kinds of questions as well. Now, moving along with our use case, if we start, scrolling here, and we'll start understanding kind of the context of the user activity, right? Everything the user did during this particular time period. So we see he went to MM43, back to MM42, changed some components, some other articles here, okay? And we'll continue analyzing this step by step. And now we've reached the bottom of the page. So let's go to the second page, and here he's creating another article. Okay, we have the article ID that's being created, another message, some operations that were conducted. Okay, and we'll go to the third page until eventually, as we're doing this analysis, we will run into the error, right? So here's the error. So the text category CTX1 is not defined for the country. Okay, and we not only can see in this example that I'm sharing with you today, all of the activity that the user was doing before this error occurred, but we noticed something interesting, which is the error did not just occur one time. It occurred 5 times, and all within a 3-second period. So obviously the user is using the error message itself, right? Okay, is the text category CTX1? No. Okay, so it must be CTX2, 3, 5, 6. Until something is accepted by the system, right? And then they can move forward. So, the long and short of this is that this insight, this user is obviously not using the best practice, but we can be very proactive with this as a support organization. So if we notice patterns of this kind of behavior, we just simply send an email out to the offending users and say, hey, look, team, this is, you should probably be looking at this lookup table. This is a correct text category for these countries, and thereby making their jobs and their behavior much more efficient, right? So that, what I'm showing you here, this user workflow, is actually the highest level of detail that we can capture with Noah, with this tool, okay? So we've talked about errors. Now I want to move forward and talk about performance, okay? So with performance, what I'd like to do, I'm going to go ahead and remove the filters that we've added so far. So we'll remove this MM42 filter, okay? Rerun this again. And I want to go to another dashboard. I want to go to the dashboard called Application Issues. And, the use case here is, the users are complaining. They're complaining that SAP is slow, okay? So the first thing we can do is we can look from an application standpoint, is there an application server that's slower than the rest, right? So here we see all of the application servers that have had activity in the last couple of weeks. And we see average response time for each of these, okay? So here we can see, okay, you know what? The server that's serving up the NetWeaver portal has an average response time of 145 seconds compared to the rest. That's pretty slow, right? And the second here is BW. If we sort this in a descending fashion, it automatically pops out at us, right, as the top 2 offenders. So, maybe we should look at the infrastructure around these applications, and, that's where your issue may be coming from. Okay, so that's one diagnosis we can do. Another one is, let's say that the issue is actually coming from my production 1 environment, my ERP. So what we're going to do is we're going to add that to my application, to my filter. So we're just going to filter the activity on this production 1 environment. Okay, so we'll go ahead and select that. And now we're just seeing the activity around production 1, okay? And the first question that comes up always is, who's being affected by this response time issue, right? So if we look at this from a regional perspective, and this is what we call user attributes in the solution. So here we're looking at the city, but we can easily be looking at the state, the business unit, department, the country, right? If everybody is accessing production 1, let's go ahead and change this metric to response time and take a look at what the response time end-to-end from the end user perspective on average is aggregated by region, okay? So if all the users are interacting with the same server, in this case production 1, why would a city be 2 or 3 times slower than the rest of the regions? You can infer that this is obviously pointing to some sort of network connectivity issue, right? Maybe it's a bandwidth limitation, maybe it's quality of connection. Whatever it is, it's absolutely not global, it's regional, and it's most likely the way that the users are connecting to the server from this region, okay? So this is another way that you can start narrowing down your focus, right, of where this issue might be and what's causing this perception of, that the system is slow. Yet another diagnosis that you can do, you can actually look at this by SAP components, right? So let's go ahead and aggregate this data by modules. And now what we're going to see is, let's sort this by average response time. And you'll see now all of the modules or transactions that have the slowest response time in SAP for my production 1 environment. Notice that a lot of these transactions are actually customization. They're Z transactions. Now this being a demo environment, it's obviously for demonstration purposes, but we see the exact same result in all of our production customers. Most of the performance issues are actually coming from customizations. A lot of times these customizations are, developed, in a rush, hastily, and they don't go through the same QA and, robustness testing that the standard SAP transactions, go through the standard process of development, testing, and QA cycles. So a lot of times, most of the issues are actually from these customizations in production, in practice. And so the question is always, okay, is it this entire transaction that's slow, or just certain components of the transaction? And also, what is the level of impact that this is having on my users? So, Noah can answer both of those questions pretty easily. Here's that second question, right? This column is active users. So how many users have been affected by each and every one of these transactions, right? So we see here that this transaction, for example, is relatively slow, but it's only affecting 1 user. This one's only affecting 3 users. And now we're seeing, this transaction here is affecting 29 users, right? So maybe we'll go ahead and focus on that one, okay? So that's the first question. The second question is, which are the components? Is it the entire transaction that's slow, or just certain components within the transaction that's causing this perception of system slowness? So one thing we can do, let's pick one at random. Let's pick this ZMGT BOMX transaction. I'm not sure what it does, but let's add this to the filter. Let's see, first of all, which screens were utilized inside the transaction, right? That's our first question. So is the entire transaction being adopted, or just certain screens inside the transaction? And of those screens, which ones are the ones that are causing this grief, right? This, poor performance. So if we go one level deeper here to the screens, now we're only looking at the activity within that transaction, and we see, okay, you know what? Only 7 screens have been utilized in the transaction in this 2-week period that we're analyzing. And not only that, but if you notice the column that says average response time, we're seeing that all but 2 screens have a sub 3-second average response time, okay? So just with this information alone, this is very, very powerful in the sense that you can go to your development team that developed this transaction and say, you know what, your issue is in these 2 screens. And this is the reason that the users are complaining that SAP is slow, right? It's not going to be the entire ecosystem. It's going to be some operation or something that they're doing within this functionality, very specifically. And we got here with 3 or 4 clicks, right? And I remind you that this is a demonstration environment, so we're seeing 88 operations, 26 operations. The real power is when you have hundreds of thousands of operations. And from the end user perspective, you have this perception of issues, but you can remove that perception very, very easily. And it facilitates where it is that you're going to focus your resources to figure out where there's a problem and what's causing the problem. So that concludes what I wanted to show you in terms of performance. Obviously, you can slice and dice the data many, many different ways, and we can continue diagnosing these things ad nauseum, as you can imagine. So what I'd like to do now is I want to go ahead and remove these filters, okay? And I want to show you yet another view. I want to show you a view that is about utilization. So we've talked so far about errors. We've talked about some use cases around that. We've talked about performance and the ways you can use this tool to help diagnose these performance issues. Now we're going to talk about utilization or adoption, right? And this is quite important. You have SAP. Obviously, there's a cost to having, owning, maintaining your SAP systems. You want to make sure that they're being adopted in the right way, right? That the users are being efficient, they're using the best practices. So the first thing we'd like to do here is I want to go here to summary activity by module as an example. And this report directly is going to show me essentially the most actively utilized modules or transactions in all of SAP during this time period, right? And what I'd like to do very quickly is add an actual filter to this report, okay? You notice with screen groups, this is the way that we actually define business processes within NOAA, within the tool. But in this case, I want to call your attention to custom transaction activity. So we'll select that, rerun the report, and now we're going to see essentially the most actively utilized Z transactions in all of SAP for my entire user population, right? And we could start noticing things off the bat. For example, this transaction here, I'm not sure what this transaction does, right? But you see that there's 14 hours of active time compared to twice that much of idle time, okay? I see that 29 users utilize the transaction. But again, this is obviously a point of inefficiency, okay? What was happening here? And we can drill down and find out, which components did this within the transaction did this inefficiency occur? Is it all my users that are being inefficient in the way they've adopted this transaction, or just some of them? And then the reason behind it, because remember, we're not just giving you the quantity of utilization, but also the quality of utilization, the context. So we can drill down all the way to the user workflow and see what specifically was done within the transaction for each user, and with that, determine, okay, why are they being inefficient? Is it because the transaction is inherently slow and they just left it processing and went to lunch, and obviously that time is being computed as being idle from a user perspective, right? Is it because they're using some other tool, third-party tool, to do their work and then just coming back and doing data input in the Z transaction? So there's many, many reasons that this could occur this way. But no matter what the reason is, it is inefficient, right? This transaction is absolutely being inefficiently adopted. So with that, I want to go to the end of the report and show you another use case. And this use case we call application rationalization. So if I go to the end of this report, now we're seeing the customizations or Z transactions that have been actively utilized by 1 or 2 users for less than 1 minute. And the key here is actively utilized, right? You can't get these metrics with any other tool. And with this, you can start saying, okay, you know what? First of all, if I'm doing something like, planning a digital transformation project, I'm probably not going to migrate these transactions. Right? It doesn't make much sense, right? It just increases the scope and the risk to the project and the resources required, and they're not even being used today, okay? And the other thing that you can do in a proactive fashion is begin eliminating and sunsetting these transactions. So each one of these customizations have a cost associated to them, right? You have to train your support team to support the transactions. Every time you do an upgrade, you have to unit test them, functionally test them. Your database has to be maintained and archived. This is an interesting statistic. 66% of your database size, your SAP database size, on average, are all taken up by customizations. So the standard operations and the standard transactions in SAP take about a third of your database space. So if you can reduce that footprint in a significant way, and just what our customers have seen is a reduction of anywhere between 40 and 60% of the current customizations can be readily eliminated or put on that short list to begin that sunsetting process. So it's very significant in terms of reducing your maintenance costs. So that's application rationalization, and that in and of itself is very powerful. Now I want to draw your attention to the same data, but let's look at it from a user-centric point of view, right? So what I've done is essentially just aggregated this by user, and now we're seeing the users themselves, okay, and how they are adopting their SAP licenses. So from a user perspective, you can actually see things like this, right? So this user has 7 hours and a half roughly of active time and 26 hours of idle time. Okay, so whatever the user is doing, obviously can be improved. Okay, because what happens when a user is idle, they are logged into the system. So a lot of times they're blocking functionality from other users, and that's something that we see that's a very common issue, right? That organizations face today. Like we did for the Z transaction report, we can actually go to the end of this report and start seeing users that have been underutilizing their SAP licenses themselves, right? So obviously these users have adoption issues, and the reasons could be varied. But if the conclusion is that some of the users may not require an SAP license, we can start reassigning these licenses to users that require them, right? Or maybe it's just a matter of lack of training or lack of access to the actual system. Whatever it may be, you're starting to realize, that now you have this insight that you didn't have before. So you can see whether a user is logged in. That part is easy, but you won't be able to see whether a user is being productive, okay? And how effective is the user within the SAP system itself. So this concludes what I wanted to show you today in terms of the product demonstration. And I guess at this time is a good time to open it up for questions.
So best way is to enter it in the chat box that you would have. Or it was all clear.
One thing I will add, just because this is a question I receive very often, is the licensing for this, right? So all of the licensing and any commercial conversations all go through SAP. SAP actually handles not only that part, but also the level 1 and level 2 support of the product itself. And the licensing as such is by monitored user. Right, so if your organization has 2,000 SAP users, then you would purchase 2,000 licenses of NOAA. And the license can be either on-premise or it can be a cloud subscription.
Yeah, and if no further questions, you can always send me an email. So the invite to you for the webinar will send out of my name and my inbox, david.dekker@sap.com. So feel free to drop me a note. What we'll do is we'll share the link to the recording for the meeting if you want to see it again or share with colleagues. And again, if there's any request for follow-up, more than happy to receive the question. And with that, I'd like to thank Eric for his time in sharing this with us, and I wish you all a good day. Thanks all.